Canada is an Arctic nation, yet only a small percentage of Canadians actually live in the Arctic. How do people living in the southern parts of Canada, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, learn about the unique and fascinating marine mammals that inhabit this enigmatic environment? Let me present the online Arctic Marine Life course. The course is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series, and we would like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centers. Our partners for this course include the Alliance of Natural History Museums of Canada, Canada's accredited zoos and aquariums, Telespark in Calgary, the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and the Discovery Centre in Halifax. You can keep track of the dates and locations of presentations on our webpage at www.vanaqua.org/Arctic Marine Life course. If you miss a presentation, you can always watch it online after it has been recorded. If you have any questions about the course or would like to register for the course after it has started, you can contact me. Our next speaker is Dr. Pat Baird from the Simon Fraser University's Center for Wildlife Ecology. She has traveled all over the world, tracking the migrations of seabirds from one continent to the next, with preference for study locations in Hawaii, Panama, and the Arctic. She is committed to public communication through lectures, developing displays for museums, giving programs for educators, and speaking to her daughter's class. Dr. Pat Baird, welcome.
Thank you. Nice being here. Well, this is good. It's going to be a very similar message to what Andrew just said, so the repetitiveness is going to be good for your memories. So this is seabirds in the Arctic, from the Arctic Ocean to Hudson Bay to the North Atlantic. So you're going to see that the whole Arctic is all one unit, so it's hard to talk just about one part of it. So what is the Arctic? We think of it as a very sort of frozen northland, dark in the winter time. But as Andrew said, it's very green in the summer. And here is a picture of it from a sort of a North Pole bird's eye view. And you see it's really, let's see, we have a little pointer here. It's all one area. So it's really, for a bird coming in this area, they really can't distinguish the US from Canada, from Russia, from Europe. It's all this polar area. And this is the Arctic Circle, and these various lines show either the 10 degrees Celsius July temperature or the tree line. This is the way we usually see it on a map, and you see that Canada's Arctic is huge. None of it is, a large part of it goes all the way to Greenland, has parts of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories pop up into it, and we also consider Hudson Bay part of the Arctic. There's a small disputed area with the United States right here, and we'll go into that a little bit later. So the 4 orders of seabirds, you're familiar with probably most of them. The penguins, you all know, the fulmars, shearwaters, and albatrosses. You know, if you've been out on a ship, out in the ocean, you've probably seen fulmars and shearwaters. They're the ones that go up on one wing and down on the other, right on the waves. And albatrosses, you have to get way out and see them in the middle of the ocean. Pelicans, cormorants, and gannets, I'm sure you've seen them. They're more temperate. You've seen them, the pelicans are the white pelicans, and they're the ones in the prairies. The gannets, of course, are in Newfoundland, and the cormorants are on the Pacific in BC and also in the Atlantic. The auks, the terns, the gulls, and the jaegers are very common. We have gulls and terns here in Vancouver, and jaegers you won't see unless you're in the high Arctic. These are auks, and that's a very large family. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So all seabirds have adapted to life on the sea. They partition the feeding niche in different ways, some by behavior, some by what they eat. There are surface feeders, plunge divers, and pursuit divers. So they all sample different levels of the ocean. There are also some are apex predators. That's at the very top of the food chain. They eat fish. Others are very low on the food web, and they eat the very small zooplankton. There are very few seabirds, though, in the Arctic. Penguins, despite the Yule cards where you see them with Santa and polar bears, are not in the Arctic. Shearwaters are not in the Arctic. They come up to the Bering Sea to feed during our summer, but they go down to the southern hemisphere to breed. You will see fulmars, as I said, out. If you're out on a ship, you won't see albatrosses, and you won't see any of this group in the Arctic. The auks, the gulls, the terns, and the jaegers dominate the Arctic. Arctic seabirds are adapted, as the marine mammals are, to these extremes of the environment and the restrictions of the environment. Many leave the area in the wintertime and become what we call pelagic, that is, they go way out into the ocean. But some do remain and forage on the ice. There are some birds who use the ocean, but we don't really consider these seabirds. Phalaropes spend a lot of the year on the ocean, but they're in the group of shorebirds. Many shorebirds use the interface between the land and the ocean. They feed in mudflats, but they are in the shorebird group. The loons and the sea ducks we don't consider seabirds, although you'll see a lot of sea ducks like buffalo heads and things like that right out here in Stanley Park. They've begun to come down and they spend the winter here. Seabirds versus other birds, what's the big difference? Well, for one thing, they're very long-lived. Some seabirds very oftentimes live to 40, 60, over 60 years. It's very common for them to do that. They're older when they first breed. Usually 3 to 5 years is normal. Albatrosses, 8 to 10 years. They have fewer young than most birds. Ducks have 15, 20 ducklings. Other little sparrows and things might have 8. Seabirds have mainly 1 or 2 young. They invest a lot of energy in their young. They will sit on the nest for hours at a time, or in the case of penguins, on the other side of the pole, they will spend a month on their nests. Most of them nest in colonies, yet some are a little bit more dispersed. Instead of being cheek by jowl in a big, wide open area, they may be in little crevices of rocks. But the one common thing they all have is they forage on the sea. All of these traits put seabirds at risk. They have longer lives, they breed later, so they have a lower chick output. They don't produce a lot of young per year, and they don't start breeding till they're older. So they have a very low replacement rate. Because they also feed on the ocean, they have a problem sometimes of getting caught in fishing nets. They will pursue the bait in the gill nets or in the long lines. They'll pursue it down, and they themselves, as the mammals, have to breathe air, and they'll get caught in the nets. If there's a poor food year in the summertime, both the chicks and the adults will suffer. The adults in trying to fish and fish and fish harder and harder to get enough food for the chicks, and the chicks, if the food is poor, won't be getting enough food to eat. In the wintertime, both the chicks and the adults can have a very poor survival factor in the wintertime if the food is not there. So let's look at the various groups. The gull group. In the Arctic, we have the glaucous gull, the herring gull, the Bonaparte's gull, ivory gull, and Sabin's gull. If you're ever in Prince William Sound, it's really neat to see the Bonaparte's gull. They nest in the conifers there, and they look just like popcorn in the trees. The first time I saw it, I was just amazed. We also have the tern group, the common tern and the Arctic tern. They look very similar. Their beaks are just a little bit different. The Jaeger group. Jaegers in Europe are called skuas. So we have 3 types in the Arctic. The parasitic Jaeger doesn't actually suck blood or anything like that. It's a kleptoparasite. And its method of foraging is it gets on another bird and makes it drop its food and gets its food that way. So that's why they call it a parasitic Jaeger. The Awk group is huge. We have the horned puffins, razorbills. Those are all on the razorbills on the east, the horned puffins on the west. The Atlantic puffin is subarctic, looks like the horned puffin. We have thick-billed murres, common murres, dovekies on the very east, and black guillemots. We also have the northern fulmar, which is in its own group. The fulmar is part of that albatross group, and they're very interesting in that they're called tube noses, and they have these little tubes on the top of their bills, and they drink seawater, and they're able to secrete the salt out these little tubes, and that's the thing they have in common. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of birds, just going over quickly their lifestyles, where they eat, what they eat, and how they live. The 3 I'm going to look at, one is something we don't really talk about too much as a seabird. It's a long-tailed jaeger. It's one of the farthest north nesting seabirds. The other is a thick-billed murre and a black-legged kittiwake. So the long-tailed jaeger is very interesting in that it eats mammals. It eats voles and lemmings, and as you all know about voles and lemmings, they have these big eruptions and these huge crashes. The jaeger is also a little different from a lot of seabirds in that it breeds pretty early and it has a very short lifespan. The female's larger than the male. They nest on the ground, and they can leave 0 to 2 eggs in the nest. And that sounds sort of strange. Why would they just put no eggs in the nest? Well, in a poor lemming year, a poor vole year, what they do, instead of trying to get enough food, they make the decision just to leave. They just get out of there. They have no need to stay there. They're not tied to that nesting spot. In years of really high abundance, they can lay as much as 4 eggs. So they can make up for it the next year. Whereas some mammals like Arctic foxes, if they're tied to the land, their populations go up and down. They follow the lemmings, crashes, and explosions. So the jaeger's unique in that. They have different kinds of foraging habitats. Many birds are kind of locked into one, but they can hover and swoop like a hawk when they get mammals, but they can also dip in the ocean the way gulls do to get fish. Here's their breeding range in Canada. And in the non-breeding season, the reason I chose them because they're unique. They get completely pelagic. And pelagic means they go out over the open ocean. And they're pretty amazing in that they spend 3/4 of their life on the wing in the ocean, and they're trans-equatorial. We oftentimes think of the Arctic tern as one that does that. The jaeger goes down both sides of North America, and it also goes completely across the Atlantic to Africa. I could not find a map that showed the whole thing, but this gives you an idea of where they go. They go way out. So you shouldn't see these near land unless there's a big storm that blows them on. This will go all the way to Africa, all the way down to South America, both sides. The black-legged kittiwake, I studied these in the subarctic and also in France. They're different from a lot of gulls in that they have little black wingtips as if they've been dipped in ink. They have these nests that are just glued onto these cliff sites, and they're very dense colonies. They're a little bit bigger than the jaeger. Their lifespan's longer. They can live up to 30 years, and they breed at 3 to 5 years. They have an interesting aspect of their chicks. They have 1 to 2 eggs, and if they have 2 eggs and they hatch, they oftentimes have siblicide. And that's especially in a poor food year, when the one older chick who was hatched first goes and just puts his wings out and pushes the other one over the nest into the ocean. In my studies on Kodiak Island in the subarctic, I found that if there was a little ledge next to the nest, that little tinier bird could escape to that and would avoid being pushed over by its older brother or sister. Also, if there's a ledge above the nest, it protects the nest from predation by hawks and by eagles. Their breeding is a little bit more spotty than that of the jaeger, and they're also in the subarctic. Their prey is mainly is fish, mainly capelin and other little surface-feeding fish, sometimes macrozooplankton. And they're surface feeders and plunge divers. A plunge diver is a bird that plunges into the ocean but doesn't go more than about a foot down. So they're just sampling the top layer. In the non-breeding season, they too become pelagic, but not as much as the Jaeger. And they're in the ice-free Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, and they also go down to Baja and all the way to Florida. And here's a picture. This is from the Birds of North America, which is out of Cornell University. It's an online publication, and it is about all the birds of North America. So you can get a subscription to that and find out to your heart's content what's going on with any bird you possibly could want to look at. And they're updated continuously. The third species I want to talk about is the thick-billed murre. It's ubiquitous in the Arctic. If I had to pick an Arctic seabird, I would pick the thick-billed murre. It's a little bit bigger than the kittiwake, has a very long lifespan, and it breeds a little bit later than the kittiwake. They nest on these huge rocky cliffs, and they're in colonies of thousands. Their prey is Arctic cod, pretty big, and they also can eat euphausiids and amphipods, which are just big zooplankton. They are pursuit divers. They're the ultimate pursuit diver. They have had pressure sensors put on them, and people have found they've gone down to 200 meters. So they're the ultimate divers to the bottom. But the normal, what they dive at is 35 to 80 meters. They nest along the edge here in the Arctic. I have friends who are studying them right now. You'll see that later. And I'm going to try to make this one little movie go. It worked earlier today. Their eggs are uniquely oval shaped. So we'll see if this, so when they roll around and around like that. So if you can imagine that if you're a bird laying an egg, not in a nest, but just on an open shelf of a cliff, you need an egg that rolls around like that. Otherwise, it would just go overboard and you wouldn't have any chicks. Also, one of the unique things about murres is that the chicks jump off the cliffs when they're only a quarter of the weight of the adults. They land in the ocean, and the male tends with them until they're fully adult, and then the male leaves them. So if you've ever been on a whale watching trip or something and you've seen something that looks like a murre, but it's really small, it's a chick. The thick-billed murre, this is just an annoying graph because they don't have all the sites that they nest at, but it's a pretty good one from the Birds of North America with the same idea. It has the dark blue is where they're breeding, and then this lighter is where they're overwintering. They are in ice-free areas, and they also come down to British Columbia and down to the very north of North America of the United States. So the question that I'm most interested in my research is how can seabirds be proxies for the ocean? How can they be indicators of what is going on in the ocean? Well, the thing you have to do is you have to look at the Arctic ecosystem as an entire ecosystem. You can't just look at seabirds. You have to look at them in relationship to everything that's in the ocean. Then the neat thing about seabirds, as I said, they're all different kinds of behavior of the way they feed and all different kinds of prey they eat. So you have them like polar bears at the very top of the food chain eating fish. You also have them down pursuit divers, and they're eating smaller invertebrates. So they are truly indicators of the entire ocean because they're sampling that entire water column. So I was going to originally call this talk A Tale of Three Seabirds. It's the best of times because it's a time when we have so many tools that we have to monitor their where they go. We have geolocators. We can track them the way Andrew tracked his walruses. We can we have depth loggers. We can find out how deep they go. We have all these tools, but it's the worst of times in that a lot of climate is changing now, and it's changing very rapidly. But then, just last week, some colleagues of mine in Japan told me about this discovery that they made, and so I'm going to add one more species to this group. And so this is hot off the press, breaking information. They said that I could talk to you about it tonight. So you heard it here first. So I decided to call these 3 seabirds and a plankton. So these are the 3 seabirds we're going to talk about. One you've seen before is the murre. Then we have something that you don't see very often, but it's a very interesting story, a dovekie. And then we have the black guillemot. This right here is a diatom. So we all know about climate change. The ice, as you see in this slide, has decreased not just horizontally, but it's also the thickness of it has decreased also over a period of years. If you want to look at it more in a vertical sense, this is huge. This is a big change for the Arctic ice. There's another way to look at it, and that's to look at how different is the temperature of the ocean now versus a baseline. And just like cold is blue and hot is red on faucets sometimes, that's what these numbers are, with these colors and these numbers down here. How many degrees away from the baseline is it? So 1982 was a fairly cool year, so it was only maybe -1 degree less than the baseline. You fast forward to 2011, for instance, here there are very few pockets of coolness. Most of it is at least 2 degrees, some of it 3 to almost 4 degrees higher than the baseline. Another way to look at it is not just looking at ocean temperatures, but looking at land ocean temperatures. And this sometimes underestimates the heat because the ocean is a big heat sink. So it holds a lot of the heat. And so this is an average, but it underestimates it. And here the same thing. This shows you how much below or above a baseline. And the baseline is this 1951 to 1980. So this is a program that you can get from NOAA. I can give you the website if you want to later. And it'll show you, if you pick any year, any length of the year, what the average temperature was. And we'll see if this movie works too. Okay, because NOAA's a dangerous site. Okay. There, so this is looking at for every 6 years how the temperature, how this has changed. So now we're in the 30s, the 1940s, the 50s, 60s. Now we're in the 70s, the 80s, 90s, early 2000, and there you go. It's changed a lot. It's a really interesting site to go play with. So why, in both of those pictures of the heat, why was the Arctic the hottest? Well, it's called Arctic amplification. So if you think of sun coming down on a snowy field or on ice, most of those rays are reflected back up into the atmosphere. But when some of that ice melts, the water's dark, and the dark water then absorbs the heat. As it absorbs the heat, it warms. Then when the atmosphere cools later on in September, because of the difference in temperature, the ocean then releases that heat back into the atmosphere, and it makes it more of a cycle, because then the atmosphere gets hotter. And that's why the Arctic has so much greater warming than other parts of the planet. So let's go back quite a few years, 18 to 21,000 years ago, to the last glacial maximum. So here's the Arctic Circle. Here you have land mass that's above ocean. Here you have land mass that's covered in ice, sea ice, and here you have the sea ice that does the melting and the freezing periodically. The reason I'm pointing this out is because there are some birds that we call Ice Age relics. They got stuck behind the Bering Land Bridge. They got stuck behind the ice that went from Canada to Greenland. And because of that, they adapted. The ones who survived, they adapted. There are two of these birds, the Guillemots and the dovekies, that are what we call obligate Ice Age feeders. They have to feed at the interface of the ice and the ocean. The thick-billed murre, whom we looked at earlier, does not, and I'll explain to you why that happens later. What happens in the breeding season of these three species is the timing of the Arctic that Andrew was talking about also, that it releases all these nutrients into the food web. So the timing of the breakup of the ice when the breeding season begins is extremely important. That is the driver for the entire ecosystem. If the breakup is earlier than it was historically, the whole system gets off. What happens with the birds is they can't adapt that quickly. So they're used to breeding at a certain time because of the light. Their pituitary turns on because of the amount of light they're getting. And that starts out all the reproductive hormones and gets the eggs starting to be formed and the breeding behavior and all of that. So they really are very hard pressed to change that. Some have maybe gone maybe a week earlier, but not much more. It's very hard for them to change the timing of breeding. So more and more you're going to hear this word, the mismatch of prey and breeding, in the bird's case of egg laying. This is an interesting photo of what happens under the ice. This is what's released when the ice starts being broken up, all these invertebrates and the fish down below. The other thing that happens when the ice breaks up early and warm water comes in is that some of the species that are in the warmer water farther south in the subarctic, they start to come in too. And you'll see how that is a problem for all of these animals. In the non-breeding season, the main problem is that the water is warmer and there might be species there that they're just not used to feeding on. So let's look at the thick-billed murre. All these data are thanks to my friend Tony Gaston from Environment Canada. They're all in published journals, and I'd be very glad to give you some of the references if you want. Here's the murre's foraging range. You see they're ubiquitous in the Arctic. They nest all over. Tony studied some right here at Coates Island for very many years, and he put data loggers on all of them, and these ranges are from his data loggers and a modeling of where the birds could go also. They eat Arctic cod. They have been eating Arctic cod, these really large Arctic cod, through the mid-1990s. But recently, with climate change, these warm water capelin, which are right here, that's the ones you saw the kittiwakes eating earlier, and the sculpin, which are bottom fish, have been found at the nest site. These, as you can tell, even though they're fairly big, they're filled with all sorts of spines and scales that aren't really digestible, and they're very hard to put down a little chick's mouth. And the capelin, as you see, are much smaller than the Arctic cod, and so they have to eat more of them. Also, with the invertebrates they eat, the problem is that the Arctic, this is an amphipod, it's related to a shrimp. It is huge, has a lot of fat and a lot of really good fat in it. The other amphipods, though, that are coming in are the Atlantic amphipods. They're coming in with the warm water. As you see, they're about a fifth the size of these. They also because they get smaller and smaller. They're mainly carapace. They're mainly this exoskeleton. It's like when you eat a lobster, most of your plate is going to be all the exoskeleton of the lobster. You don't get a lot of meat. So the problem with these is not only do you have to eat more, but a lot of what you eat isn't really too digestible. And the fat they have in them isn't as good as the fat in the Arctic species. So this means more trips to get these prey for both the capelin and the smaller amphipods. And so these adults are expending more energy going out, fishing for the chicks, coming back, going out again. And the chicks grow more slowly because they're not getting enough nutrients or they're not getting the right nutrients. The other thing that's happening is some of these warm water species are coming in to the area. So here's where my friend Tony is doing his studies. So these razorbills, which are more warm water, they're down here, they're coming up to 2,000 kilometers into Hudson Bay and feeding there because their prey is going there. So they're following their prey. So they're competing with the thick-billed murres also. So the thick-billed murres are getting it not just from their food, but from competitor seabirds. The second bird I want to talk about is the dovekey. And this is the data here are thanks to a friend of mine down in California, Nina Karnofsky. Dovekeys are different in that they don't nest on big cliff ledges. They nest in these little scree rocks, in these little holes in between the rocks. Usually you think of them more like near Svalbard, Spitsbergen, Fritz Joseph Land, Novia Zemlya, and Iceland. They're very common here, but there are also some in Greenland, as you see here, and one colony on Baffin Island there, so we can claim them as a Canadian species. And then here their colonies are in Greenland, around here, and then here is their winter distribution. They are very different in that they eat very low on the food chain. They eat copepods, these very, very small crustaceans, and these copepods themselves are the ones that eat the phytoplankton. The ice is retreating currently where they forage, and they're one, I remember I said they were obligate ice edge foragers, so their forage trips are also longer from the ice edge back to the colony, to the ice edge, trying to get these copepods. And the problem is also the warming water is bringing in these smaller warm water copepods. Just like the amphipods, there's not as much energy in them, and the birds have to work harder to feed their chicks. So therefore, again, the reproductive success is very poor. The third and final bird I'm going to talk about tonight is one that has been probably the most studied, the longest studied on the entire planet. George DeVoke is an old friend of mine. He's been working on Cooper Island for 40 years, and he self-funded this just by doing odd jobs in the wintertime. He funded himself for 20 years because he knew it was important to keep going back, and now he's established there. But he has been doing this work continuously since 1975. These are ice age relics, and they need to forage at the ice edge. The Canadian distribution, they almost always forget this Cape Parry colony right here. They're mainly in the eastern Arctic, and there's some down in the subarctic. So here, for instance, is a foraging distribution of them. They've left out Cape Parry, but this is where the Guillemots are. But the colony we're going to look at is right on the other side of that disputed area between Canada and the US, is Cooper Island, and it's right up here, this little red dot. This is what it looks like. It's very flat. It's a couple kilometers long, just about sea level. This is what it looks like. George has pulled all these crates and pieces of wood over there for shelters for the chicks, to shelter them from aerial predators like peregrines and things like that. The black guillemots ate Arctic cod until 2000, just the way this thick-billed murres did. The there's 1 fish per hour that these birds bring back to their chicks. But as you see, unlike those pictures you've seen of puffins, they can only bring 1 fish back per bill load. And here's what happened with the Arctic cod. They've dropped off tremendously between 1906 and 2007. It's just plummeted. So these chicks now are also eating sculpin. It started out with the birds bringing back normal size fish, Arctic cod. Then they went to first year Arctic cod, and now they're bringing back these sculpins. Although they're big, as I said before, they're filled with all these bones and spines and aren't as nutritious and are very hard for the chicks to get down their gullets. This semicircle is historically the area where the birds would go out to feed. They'd be at Cooper Island, they go out to the ice edge here, they go out to the ice edge there, they'd forage and come back to feed their fish. Their chicks would go from this to this. In 35 days, they increased tenfold in their weight. And that was fine until the late 90s, early 2000s. This is just a schematic that George drew just to compare very briefly the sea surface temperature in August. So this is August to September. This is September, August to September. This is now. This is back in the 80s. And all these slides George lent me. And the problem with some of them is that he hasn't analyzed all his data equally. So sometimes when I'm talking about the present, maybe it's 2014, 2012. It could be 2011, or it could be 2007. But just realize that anything from 2005 onward is very different from what it used to be before. So this is more of schematic. Let me just walk you through this. The thing to look here is this is the amount of open water, with light blue being open water and dark red being 90% or 9/10 ice. So hatching is late. 20th July is when these chicks hatch. When they first started hatching, let's say look at back in 2006. This is not even the 90s when this ice was closer. You have most of it is 90%. Here you have the 90%, the 9/10 going back a little bit with some open water and some thinner ice here. By 2011, you have thinner ice here. The thicker ice is way back here. Here, 1st of August, this is way they have some hatching still, but it's early growth. It's when the chicks are really putting on weight. They're really doubling their weight every week or so. Here, again, now you have the ice in 2005 really close, but because it's getting warmer, the summer's progressing, there's more insulation down coming from the sun. You have the ice going away faster here than it did over here. And 2011, in this stage, there's just a little bit left right here. It's even worse when the birds are going to fly away, when they fledge from the colony, 1st of September. Here it was in 2005. It's still pretty far away. This is their normal historical route they took. They're just hitting the ice edge there. By 2007, it's gone. 2011, it's gone. Looking at this more from an overview at Alaska and more of the Arctic Ocean, here going back to 1980, you can see it's really fast to the land. Going back a little bit, 1996, 2012 is disappearing. And here you see it's retracting from Canada, which is over here, is getting a lot farther. 15th of August, end of the, getting towards the end of the summer, it's retreating much more rapidly. And here you have a little bit of ice left in Canada. This whole area is free water. Then you have fledging, the same thing, and here the ice is retracted. This is all open. So anybody who's an ice edge feeder doesn't have the ice. This illustrates it. This is the sea surface temperature from 1980 to about 2010, 2015. It varies back and forth, but it has this real jump right here and is going all over the place. It's pretty high. And the distance to the ice is mimicking it. The birds fed maybe 40 kilometers up to maybe 80. It would go back and forth. It goes up to almost 200 kilometers away. That's a huge distance for these small birds to forage, to get food for their chicks and come back. So what they're doing, they're either choosing not to do it because they get so depleted in their own energy going back and forth, or they choose to just eat those sculpin and benthic food that are much less nutritious. And so here's what's been happening to Cooper Island. The reproductive success of the birds has been going down. This is when George first started. It looks like it's all over the place. This is just a regression line, but you see the basic trend is downwards. These are the kinds of data that people like myself are gathering to look at birds as proxies or indicators of the ocean. The thing about seabirds that's so neat is that even though they're foraging all over the ocean, they come in the summertime to a colony to breed. So you can go to the colony and you can gather all this information. You can look at the numbers of the seabirds, have the numbers change from year to year. If the birds aren't there like the Jaeger, it could mean something, could mean that the prey's not there. If the chicks are starving or if the chick growth is very slow, you can bet that the prey items that the adults are getting for them are of poor quality. So you can use all these parameters from the birds on the colony to give you a lot of information about what's going on in the ocean. You can look at how their prey is changing, how what they're bringing back now is very different from what they were bringing back in the 1990s. And then you can make assumptions of what's going on in the ocean. The black guillemot, as I said, is an obligate ice edge feeder. This is what the chicks would see when they were first leaving the colony back in the 1980s. They're programmed, they're hardwired to feed on the ice, and so there's no question here, ice, food, they would go to it. In 2012, when a chick is ready to fledge, it looks out. This is what it sees. Which direction does it go? Does it go left? Does it go right? Does it go straight? There's no cue here. And even if they got up really high, that ice is 180 to 200 kilometers away. They can't see it. So this is what they're stuck with. Also, with more storms and with no ice to hold the waves, you're finding huge waves coming in the Arctic right now. And for a small little island like Cooper, it's eroding the shoreline quite rapidly. As the thick-billed murres had, the black guillemots also have competitors from warmer climates. The horned puffin breeds in the Bering Sea is coming up, and it's not only competing with the black guillemot, it's also killing their chicks. So this is the increase in the number of horned puffins up to 2010, and they regularly kill up to half of the guillemot nestlings. The other thing that's happened, as Andrew was saying in the mammal lecture, is that the polar bears' ice pads are getting smaller and smaller. They're disappearing, so the polar bears are coming to land. And that's what has happened at Cooper Island. The polar bears have started to come in. And they don't really care about human scent. It doesn't bother them at all. They make themselves quite at home. So what George did is he made these plastic cases to protect the chicks, to put them inside as artificial nests to protect them. Those boards that they had just didn't do it. That was good for aerial predators like falcons and things, but not for polar bears. But the polar bears learned that if you shook it long enough, a chick would fall out. This is the number of polar bears on Cooper Island. You see it's just increased exponentially. This goes hand in hand with ice melt in the Arctic. So this is just one snapshot of one season of 94 nests. There were almost about 2 eggs per nest of the black guillemots, 183 hatchlings, eaten or killed by polar bears. 90 by horned puffins, 81. Other causes were starvation, 11. Out of the whole colony, 1 chick fledged. That is not enough to maintain any colony. Even though these birds live a long time, even if there were just 20 or maybe 30 chicks coming off of this colony, it's not enough to maintain it. The black guillemot could be one of the losers in the Arctic in the near future. But this is the part that's the breaking news, that the heart of this whole ecosystem is a small algae. It's called a diatom. It's a little plankton. We call it the magic diatom because it is the heart of the whole ecosystem. This is the one you find in the Arctic. They're at the bottom of the food web. They're common throughout all marine systems. They're here in Vancouver, they're in San Francisco, they're in Panama, they're all over. They're the very bottom of the food web. They're the prey of all sorts of zooplankton, from copepods to amphipods to euphausids, all sorts of things like that, that the fish eat, but then other things eat, the marine mammals and the seabirds. The thing that's neat about diatoms, they make these fatty acids. We're just going to call them huffa and puffa for right now, but they stand for highly unsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids. In the short Arctic summer, these diatoms just photosynthesizing like crazy. They're making all this fat and they're storing it. Here's one from Roberts Bank, and you see all these little fat globules that it's storing. It just creates huge amounts of this. And so this huffa and puffa are these long chain omega-3 fatty acids we've all heard of. And the thing that's important is that they break down in the diatom to EPA and DHA. And I know if you read any health food, anything, you'll find that these are essential fatty acids. The important thing is animals cannot make these. We cannot make them at all. Humans cannot make them. You have to get it from your food. We get it from our food that has gone through a long process, and there's evidence that there's a transfer from the marine to the terrestrial ecosystem a lot by birds. So this diatom is responsible for these essential fatty acids that humans and all animal life need that none of us can produce. What this is needed for is growth in chicks. This EPA and DHA is important for membranes, and so that's important in embryo growth, in cell repair. If you get a cut, your skin cells are repairing and using a lot of this EPA and DHA in the membranes to repair your body. The really interesting thing is that the diatom is very, I get the two mixed up. In migration, it modifies the flight muscles. It actually physiologically modifies the flight muscles to enable long endurance flight. So for all migrant birds, shorebirds, seabirds, anything that migrates, they need these fatty acids. The fatty acids are also stored as fuel. They're very dense energy and they're very easy to mobilize. So during migration, these birds can just mobilize this. They don't have to stop. They can mobilize it from their body where they've stored it, and they can keep going. Again, they're not able to get it from plants or non-marine organisms. It has to come from the marine ecosystem. So with climate change, we really don't know what's going to happen with these diatoms. They have a very narrow window in which they can live of salinity, temperature, and pH. pH is acidity. They can only live within this certain range. We don't know what happens when, let's say, more fresh water comes in or more salty water comes in. We're not sure, but we can speculate that they're not going to do well. So climate change or some kind of anthropogenic alteration to the environment, to change the temperature, to change the salinity, to change the pH, might upset this very delicate balance of the diatom where it's living. And since it's at the bottom of the food chain, that whole delicate balance will be upset all the way up, the entire food chain, up to the apex predators. So that's why we call it a magic diatom, because it really is the center of all of this food and is the center of all of Arctic life, all of these seabirds from the Arctic, and also all marine mammals. Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and take some questions. Anyone have any questions for our speakers? Okay, pop over.
Hi, I'm just wondering if there has been any restoration efforts for the black guillemots, or are you just going to continue monitoring them until potential extinction?
Well, he's just monitoring them right now. There hasn't been really any talk. I mean, what can you do with them? The thing about these birds is oftentimes these birds return to the exact same nesting spot. So it's not as if you can just move them and say, well, here we have this new place that's this predator free. They've been doing things like that in Hawaii when they've moved the endangered Hawaiian petrel and they've put it on another island behind a predator fence that keeps all predators out. And they move them when they're chicks in the burrow, and they can put them back in the burrow and hand feed them. So when the chicks finally come out in the light, they think that's where they hatched. But for these birds that are nesting on the surface, it's really hard to do that. But that's a good question, but no, nothing's been said right now about the black guillemots.
Is there another question right over here? Did someone over here have a question? I thought I saw two hands. Okay, any other questions? So we need to make the bumper sticker that says "Save the Diatom."
Yes.
Is that?
Save the diatom.
And
Right.
Is there any research that talks about how changing temperatures affects the productivity or the abundance of the diatoms?
My colleagues in Japan are doing that right now, and there's a man at Ryerson University who's going to come out here in the spring and work in Roberts Bank to look at some of them. So it's just beginning. We just realized that, like a lot of shorebirds, instead of what we thought they were eating, like the little tiny clams and things in the mud, they're actually skimming this very, very thin layer of the ocean right at the surface, and they're eating these diatoms.
How come it takes so, how come the diatoms only discovered recently? Is it because they're very small, or is it because?
People in science have their specialized niches, just as birds have their specialized niches to forage. So the diatom people were working on diatoms, and the bird people were working on birds. And the real connection was when these Japanese researchers came over here with just these huge lenses and filmed or videoed hours and hours and hours of these shorebirds feeding, and then would very laboriously go through frame by frame looking at them. And that's when they discovered that instead of actually going into the mud, these shorebirds were just sucking up what one of my friends just calls sort of ocean snot. It's just the stuff on the very top, just a bunch of polysaccharides and the diatoms. And so they sampled, and they were wondering, well, what are these birds eating? Why are they not getting the clams and like the little worms or whatever they would be getting in the mud, which is what we assumed. And then we found out what they were eating, and that's when we started talking with the diatom people. So, I mean, we should have, when there is an Arctic conference here, I believe in December, that brings people from all different fields together. But we need to do that more often. We can't just be in our own groups giving talks to other bird people, giving talks to other mammal people, to diatom people or whatever. You have to have a connectivity because, as you see, the Arctic is completely, the whole planet's connected this way. We just looked at the Arctic, but there are stories like this throughout the whole planet. But that's a long answer to your question.
You had mentioned that birds are a bit of an apex predator in the Arctic. Do they have any predators themselves? Are they prey for any animals in the Arctic?
Oh yes, the marine mammals will drag one down if they can. They'll just drag them down by the feet. I've seen gulls without legs, for instance, and that's probably what happened to them. Some of the like eagles could kill some of them, but it's mainly the chicks. A lot of the adults really don't have too many predators themselves. Humans, and then of course the anthropogenic changes, and then also with fishing, they get caught in fishing lines.
Any concerns about as development occurs up in the Arctic? I know this is maybe a little bit off the topic, but as shipping comes in and boats lighting and potential drilling, or like, is there anything from that kind of industrial use of the Arctic that might affect seabirds?
Yes, I wish I'd known your question before. I would have a couple slides to show you from that. With lighting, it's very hard. The birds get disoriented. For instance, the puffins in Iceland, at one of the Westman Islands had a volcano erupt, and instead of the birds jumping off the cliff into the water, they now jump into the town, because the town is built off on the volcano that has spread lava all over. And so what the villagers do is they pick the birds up. The reason they jump into the town is because of lights. Usually the ocean, when the moon is out, is very light, and the birds head towards that. Now they head towards the town, just like a drilling rig. They'll go towards the light. There are many papers out on that. And then Tony Gaston from Environment Canada has a really great map of, I think you remember that one map of where the birds were all foraging, the thick-billed murres that had those little dots all through, like near Baffin Island and things. He had a picture of all the potential shipping lanes for when the Arctic gets developed, went right through all of those foraging areas. And George, my friend, had one from a Northwest Passage, from the shipping from that. Goes right up the Bering Sea, past all the bird colonies there. It goes right across Cooper Island. So yeah, there will be conflicts, and who knows what that'll be.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Pat. We appreciate you coming out.
Very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. The Vancouver Aquarium Marine Science Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of aquatic life. If you'd like to support the aquarium and its programs, you can go to www.vanaqua.org. Thank you very much. Good night.